String jungles to the high Andes, Bolivians cast ballots on Sunday in a tense election, pitting the socialists who ran the country until last year against a range of opponents seeking to stop the return to power. The exit polls were set to offer insight into an election viewed as a gauge of the strength of democracy in Latin America. Going into Sunday, opinion polls showed ours close to the threshold needed for a first-round victory. To avoid a runoff, the candidate must win more than 50% of the vote, or at least 40% with a 10-point margin of victory. Results are now flown in, and the M.A.S. has come to power.
Not to be outdone, here's Bolivia. Considering they've had 15 military dictatorships and 17 constitutions, you'd think some stability would lend confidence to business. However, Bolivia has far more pressing matters. The fall of American-supported dictatorships in Latin America towards the end of the 20th century opened a door to populist and leftist politics. This pink tide, as it was known, expressed itself in Bolivia at the same time as the rise of indigenous empowerment. In 2006, Evo Morales took power, and this year he is their longest ever serving president. The first indigenous person to take power in the nation, he extended many of those rights and protections to the natives that they'd been denied for a long time. Since its brutal exploitation by the Incas and the Spanish, the memory of colonialism is alive and well in this region. Slavery was the killer of indigenous people, and silver is the glamorous metal that gets all the press. But for its extraction, there were used many more hazardous materials, like even mercury. Yeah, you know, that thing that sent the Mad Hatter insane. Understandably, Bolivia has a vigilance, even an over-vigilance, about its natural resources and its territory. Morales rose many of the same barriers that Peronists sometimes introduced into Argentina, but he enshrined them in the Bolivian constitution. Limited land ownership and the state's role in business. One example of anti-imperialism in the document is the protections awarded to the native use of the coca plant against the American drug war. Mining even has its own chapter in the document. Morales also has a habit of nationalizing and privatizing at will. It is possible for business to exploit a developing country with natural resources, history has shown that, but it's absolutely not inevitable. As Chile and others have shown, with the right systems, your legal and criminal protections will be perfectly sufficient. But guess which protections Bolivians don't have? The World Bank's assessment of financial legal rights in Bolivia measures at a whopping 0 out of 12.
So the president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, he's a leftist president. He has reportedly been forced to step down by the Bolivian military. Now, there was recently an election. He won the election, but his opponents were alleging that there were vote irregularities. So what happened is he agreed to a new election. He said, okay, fine, I'll accept your findings, and we'll allow a new election. But then, seemingly out of the blue, he stepped down. So weird. He agreed to a new election, but then all of a sudden he's doing an announcement where he's saying, I'm stepping down. Well, it turns out it's a coup. It's a military coup that's happening against him. The military is like, we strongly suggest that you step down, which is code word for, we're going to make you step down. Thread. If you haven't been following the situation in Bolivia, here's a rundown. Briefly, the M.A.S., an emboldened opposition, which is clearly not the most popular party in the country, the media, and the Trump administration ousted a successful leftist leader. For the longer story, Evo Morales, the first indigenous president in a country that is majority indigenous, has overseen an economic transformation since his first term, and he's very popular to this day. Now, I'll go over more specifics on that later. I'll give you some of those numbers later. He was initially barred from running for another term by term limits. He sought a referendum to abolish term limits, but it was narrowly defeated. Yet the Supreme Court ruled that term limits were unconstitutional, so he was permitted to run again. If you think this invalidates the election or means that Morales is authoritarian, please explain to me why court decisions in Bolivia should be interpreted in a different way than any other country. Okay, let's continue. The election happened on October 20th. To win in this first round, a candidate needs to get at least 50% of the vote, or 40% and win by 10 percentage points over the next highest candidate. To understand what all the controversy is about, you need to know that there are two counts in the Bolivian system. The TREP quick count and the official count. The quick count is so that on election night, some results are released. The Organization of American States, OAS, which observes elections and provides technical guidance, has been recommending these types of systems and implementing them in a variety of countries, including Bolivia. This list has more places where it's been implemented. A quick count is supposed to provide confidence that the election is progressing normally and give the media something to report on. To me, two sets of results seem like it would be confusing, and this time it was. As the results were coming in, Carlos Mesa, Morales' main opponent, was already saying how he had progressed to the second round. He was saying this based on the quick count and based on incomplete results from the quick count. Here it is. And then it shows a little excerpt there. When the quick count reached 83.85% of vote sheets counted, the Electoral Authority held a press conference reporting the result. The results at this point were Morales 45.71% and Mesa received 37.84%, a difference of 7.87 percentage points. This would indicate a second round. But remember, this is only 83.85% of the result and is not the official count. This is slightly over 10 percentage points, so all hell broke loose and they were immediately accused of fraud. I should point out here that we are still not talking about the official count, which is the only legal vote count. Anyway, the OAS released a statement where they said that the jump for Morales between these two data points was impossible. It was an inexplicable change in trend and drastically modifies the fate of this election, which was repeated in a later report. But as our paper shows, it's not only possible, it's probable. There's little change in trend between the before the quick count was suspended and after it was restarted. This is because Morales' support is largely rural and thus reports results later. This quick count trend matches very well with the eventually official count result, as well as results from the legislative elections. 500 scenarios show Morales' margin. Eventually, the official count was released. Morales won in the first round 47.08 to 36.51. If you had been watching the polls before the election, 5 out of 6 of them predicted the same result. Weird to have a fraud that matches up with the polls. Okay, so I know that's a lot there, and by the way, the thread goes on for a much longer time frame. And I'll give you one more. He says, unfortunately, the damage was done, especially because the media misunderstood the difference between the two counts, and the opposition started terrorizing Morales supporters in the streets. Morales agreed to abide by an OAS audit of the results, but curiously, Mesa did not. Okay, so bottom line is this. They had the election, okay? When 83% of the results came in from the quick count, it had Morales up by about 7 points. That would mean that there's a runoff election, because in order for it to be over in the first round, he has to get 10%, he has to be leading by 10% or more, okay? When we got more of the quick count, about 95% of the quick count, he was leading by just over 10 percentage points. So that means election over. With the official count, he's leading by more than 10 percentage points. That would mean election over. But what they're saying is, hey man, the OAS is saying, hey man, this is sketchy, and they were conflating the accounts, the official count and the quick count, and they made it seem like that when the results kept rolling in at the end and he started building a bigger lead, that they say that was election fraud. And there's no way that could have happened. This is according to the OAS. But apparently, the way the vote counts come in, the more rural areas come in later for obvious reasons, and those areas are more pro-Morales, so it's actually perfectly expected that he would, if he didn't have a lead, he would get a lead, or if he had a lead, he would grow his lead. It's like saying, oh my God, Oklahoma came in, and that's massively for Donald Trump. That's got to be election fraud. Well, no, Oklahoma is going to go to the Republican, so that's not. That's actually very predictable. So it's like a similar dynamic here. Now, the really interesting and important facts are that Morales said, hey man, you want to have another election anyway, even though I won by over 10 points? Fine, go right ahead. I think that's huge. Because that means, if he's trying to steal the election, that's a weird way of stealing it by saying, go ahead, have the election again. If they went through all this trouble to rig this election, would you really be like, okay, even though I won it, don't care, go right ahead? That sounds to me like a guy who's confident that he won, and he's actually like, hey, let's not cause any trouble here. Go right ahead, do the election, and whatever happens, happens. So, but then it got really shady and scary because Morales goes on TV and says, I'm resigning, I'm stepping down. And at this time, Morales' cohorts, other members of his party and his government, were being targeted violently. Opposition forces were burning down their houses. And also, his house was ransacked. And he was terrified. And so he stepped down. He was forced to step down by the military. That's like the textbook definition of a coup. And now everything is up in the air, and the opposition is rounding up, people from the government and supporters. And it looks ugly, man. It looks like what used to happen in South America when the U.S., directly controlled and invaded, and the CIA toppled governments. And many argue that's exactly what's going on right now, man.
On Sunday, Bolivia will hold presidential elections that could mark the return to power of Evo Morales' movement towards socialism, or M.A.S. Two of his closest allies, Luis Arce and David Choquehuanca, are running for president and vice president. Morales was deposed and then exiled in November of last year. Accusations of electoral fraud led to protests, which paved the way for a coup orchestrated by right-wing evangelical Christians and the military. That may not be easy. Morales was the first indigenous president of a majority indigenous country. His 14 years in power saw steady economic growth and millions lifted out of poverty. His attempt to stay in power for a fourth term may have backfired, eventually leading to the coup. But his political career is far from over. From his new home in Argentina, Morales still runs his party. In this rally, which took place in January, Morales formally announced that Arce and Choquehuanca would represent M.A.S. in the election.
Y vamos a volver al gobierno. Vamos a volver al gobierno, no con armas como la derecha, no con balas como los racistas fascistas.
O sea, le pregunto, ¿lo que pasó fue o no un golpe de Estado?
Un golpe de Estado porque mi mandato terminaba el 22 de enero de este año. Segundo, la policía se suma a los golpistas. Y tercero, el mando militar pide mi renuncia. La mejor prueba del golpe de Estado. ¿Qué pensé yo? No renunciar, estar dentro de la selva como de la zona del trópico y vamos a gobernar, pero con un policía amotinada, fuerza armada que me pedían renuncia. Evité que haya masacre. Nuestro delito es, hemos demostrado que otro mundo es posible. Un mundo sin el sistema capitalista es posible. Un mundo sin el Fondo Monetario Internacional es posible. Eso hemos demostrado. Hemos empezado a construir la nueva Bolivia. Ahora me lo están destrozando.
De hecho, el gobierno interino en Bolivia ha estado tumbando estatuas de usted, tapando murales, eliminando imágenes que existen de usted y de su nombre. ¿Usted qué opina de eso?
Tumbarán estatuas, taparán nombres, letreros, pero nunca van a olvidar los mitos sociales de nuestro gobierno. Nunca van a destrozar la memoria de los pueblos. Nunca se va a eliminar la historia, tanta historia que hicimos desde Bolivia. No se puede entender semejante, yo digo, salvajismo.
Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo les va? Bienvenidos a esta edición especial del Noticiero Internacional de la Televisión Pública a propósito de las decisivas elecciones presidenciales que se están concretando, se terminaron de concretar hace un rato en Bolivia. Elecciones que tienen algunas particularidades, básicamente se celebran bajo un gobierno de facto posterior al golpe de Estado contra Evo Morales y que además podrían marcar la vuelta, el retorno del movimiento del socialismo al poder. ¿Qué es lo que se sabe? Ayelén Rulo, ¿cómo andan?
¿Cómo estás, José?
¿Qué es lo que sabemos hasta ahora?
Bueno, hasta el momento la certeza que tenemos, y no es menor, es que se han desarrollado en una situación de normalidad. Esto lo confirmaba el presidente del Tribunal Supremo Electoral, Salvador Romero, hace instantes nomás, donde, según digamos, las distintas fuentes que hemos consultado que están actualmente en La Paz y en distintos puntos de La Paz, no ha habido mayores complejidades en ese proceso. Por supuesto, esto digamos, puede variar, pero hasta el momento es esa la certeza que tenemos desde aquí.
Sweltering jungles to the high Andes, Bolivians cast ballots on Sunday in a tense election, pitting the socialists who ran the country until last year against a range of opponents seeking to stop the return to power. The exit polls were set to offer insight into an election viewed as a gauge of the strength of democracy in Latin America. Going into Sunday, opinion polls showed ours close to the threshold needed for a first-round victory. To avoid a runoff, the candidate must win more than 50% of the vote, or at least 40% with a 10-point margin of victory. Results are now flown in, and the M.A.S has come to power.